Your video is still on, Chris.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mike Butterworth. I'm the director of the Center for Sports Communication and Media in the Moody College of Communication at the University of Texas at Austin. And welcome to our 6th of 6 virtual town hall events that we have been hosting over the course of this emerging pandemic and continuing pandemic. It's been our pleasure to be able to host a range of experts who have offered us commentary on a host of issues. Today, we have the opportunity to talk specifically about youth sports and family communication and how those have been impacted by the pandemic and the varying levels of shutdown. So thank you so much for joining us. And at this point, I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce our 5 guests, beginning with Dr. Matt Bowers. Dr. Bowers is an assistant professor in the Department of Kinesiology and Health Communication at, as you can see from the carefully chosen shirt, the University of Texas at Austin. He's got expertise in a range of issues, but in particular is interested in youth participation in sports and reimagining the sports experience for children. Matt, thanks so much for being here with us.
My pleasure.
Next up is Elizabeth Flores-Amaya. She is the Director of Community Impact for the Women's Sports Foundation, a nonprofit organization which is dedicated to the experience of enhancing the experience of girls and women in sports. And she has been involved in particular with youth programs and integrating girls into women's sports experiences. And so we're delighted to have her here. Elizabeth, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, next up, we've got Trennis Jones. Trennis Jones is the Executive Director of the Central Texas chapter of the Positive Coaching Alliance. He is a former Division I athlete from the University of Colorado, though he is a Austin, Texas native. Spent some time as a sports agent and working for the Phoenix Suns before coming to the Positive Coaching Alliance. Trennis, thanks for being here.
Appreciate you having me.
Next up is Dr. Karlee Posteher. Dr. Posteher is an assistant professor of management and business communication at California State University, Monterey Bay. And she is an expert in interpersonal and organizational communication, specifically drawing on her own Division I athletic experience and coaching experience, specifically interested in how athletes are recruited to colleges. And so, Karlee, thanks very much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. And last up is Dr. Jimmy Sanderson. Dr. Sanderson is an assistant professor in the Department of Sport Management at Texas Tech University. And Dr. Sanderson is one of the pioneers of sports communications interest in social media research. Of late, though, has shifted his attention more specifically to youth sports and family communication. And as you can see, is bringing the youth sports to the experience today, live at his son's baseball game, 15U baseball game. Jimmy, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for accommodating my schedule.
Now we're happy to have the background to enhance our experience here. So delighted to have all of you here, and looking forward to the conversation. I think where we might want to start is by recognizing there's been obviously a tremendous amount of coverage and attention in sports media about how we manage in this world without sports. But most of that attention has been directed at high profile, heavily mediated commercial sports. And although some people are certainly talking about youth sports, that's not getting the same kind of attention. And so it might be helpful for us to start by identifying some of the ways that the pandemic has affected sports differently, and how that has impacted the experience for kids involved in sports. And Elizabeth, why don't we start with you, especially because your work is focused on community impact. How would you describe the differences for youth sports in this moment?
Well, I think that in this moment, it's affecting the community partners that we work with significantly, because it's affected every aspect of their operation. So their programs, finance, fundraising, facility, and staffing. And it's also forced them to reimagine their programming in a virtual setting, something that's new to them. And many of them have had to pivot their services to provide vital resources such as grab and go food services and mental health. So they are taking this challenge and creating it as an opportunity, and reimagining their programming and finding ways to reconnect with their youth and the families they serve.
So I certainly invite other members of the panel to comment on this. Are there other ways that that we think that youth sports are being affected uniquely in this moment?
I think for me, just it's the sheer number of people who are affected. So, I mean, if you talk about everything from the high school, junior high, to Little League, to community, to the club and travel, I mean, in terms of scope, I just think there's so many people affected, and I really, we can get into this, but I think there's going to be some really interesting changes to youth sports because, as we know, a lot of families, pinch pennies and spend money they don't have so their kids can participate in some youth sports. And I don't know that a lot of families are we may see, I'm curious to hear what other people think, but I think we may see a bigger divide moving forward because some parents just may not have, some things are going to have to be cut, and youth sports might be what gets cut.
Yeah, as we look at some of the numbers we have on this, the last time we had an economic downturn, the sort of 2009 to 2014 period, we saw about a 7% decline in participation across youth sports. A lot of those kids never came back after that, and I anticipate this to actually be even bigger. There's been some recent surveys done by some of my friends at the Aspen Institute and some of my colleagues that has reached out and tried to get a sense for what to expect and what are parents feeling right now about their kids and when they come back, and some really stark numbers that have come out of that is roughly a fifth of the parents surveyed said that their kid has lost interest in sports during this period, and roughly a fifth again said that they don't anticipate their kid returning to sports. So we're talking 18 to 20% right there, and with household income, as Jimmy said, with household income being the number one predictor of when you start playing sports, how long you stay in sports, during a time like this, it's going to be a real challenge to be able to continue to provide access. We weren't doing a great job before, and so it's just going to be potentially exacerbated.
I would echo Matt's point, especially, even within the schooling piece, right? Like, if your kid plays football or basketball, potentially that's something that can survive. If your kid's a swimmer, if your kid plays another sport that maybe isn't as populated, then those unfortunately, would be on the cutting room floor with respect to that. So you are losing not only the kids that maybe have lost interest, but you're also losing the kids that participate in those sports that aren't the big three with respect to our country and the sports that we play primarily.
Yeah, I agree with what you're all saying. And when you think about the pause that we're all talking about with really life, but sports specifically, pausing pro sport or higher levels of competition of sport is very different than pausing youth sports, in the sense that the child is progressing. And so each day, each week that goes by, we're missing opportunities to develop as a team, to develop physiologically, that maybe a pro athlete at home can keep in shape. But this is just an opportunity that keeps sadly sliding by. So it's a big deal.
Karlee, can I follow up with you on that? How does that translate then also to the sort of communicative habits that we believe are central to youth sports, understanding teamwork and how to handle conflict and overcoming adversity, those kinds of lessons that are so baked into why we value youth sports? How does that carry over?
Absolutely. And it worries me, because while teams do a really good job of attempting to keep that team environment going through virtual means, we have to admit that's not quite the same as dealing with conflict in the moment, dealing with a loss, frustration. And so I'm actually very curious to hear from maybe others who are more involved with the esports or virtual aspect. I think that teams are starting to turn to that, to use esports for competitive and gathering of teams, and to just keep that dynamic going, because that is, we know from, like Matthew said, the Aspen Institute puts out so much great research on how valuable these life skills are, and I'm worried that we're not fostering those right now.
Yeah, it's a challenge.
Certainly.
Right? Oh, go ahead, Trennis.
Go ahead, Matt.
It's a real challenge, because a lot of the benefits that accrue from sport participation come from that kind of interactive, interdependent social dynamic. And so how do you replace that in a virtual setting? You can't really replace it, in the same way, but there are efforts underway to try to leverage the capabilities associated with esports and things of that nature, but it's unclear the extent to which those translate the same benefits, right? And it's not that sport participation is, wholly a good thing, right? There's a lot of potential for negative things as well. Sport is our context through which we are pursuing these things. And so there's the potential for this to, for us to re-envision this setup, the way that things operate, because when else will you have such an external shock to such a large system? And so there's part of me that bends towards that kind of optimism that, okay, well, maybe we can do this. Maybe this pushes us back to more free play, more pickup sports, unstructured experiences, neighborhood sports. We grow youth sports by getting smaller, actually, in the way that we think about it. Or maybe we don't, maybe it sort of amplifies the issues that we already have. And that's something that we don't know. I mean, folks like Elizabeth and Trennis, who are doing work directly in this area, are going to probably have their finger on the pulse of that a little bit more than I am. But I don't know. What do y'all think with that? Trennis, you were going to speak anyway. So
yeah, I think number one, it requires that we be a lot more intentional with our behaviors and what we actually are putting forth in front of these kids, especially when we're talking about character development and, you know, the types of things that they can learn from sports. You know, a lot of times we can assume that they'll learn teamwork because they're on a team and they're at practice and at games. And so at some level they pick that up, whether it be good or bad. In this case, I think we have to be really, really thoughtful about the seeds that we're planting with these kids, the thoughtfulness around them learning certain things, what it means to respect your teammate, even if it's maybe you're on a Zoom as opposed to, you know, in dugout, right? Like there are transferable things that I think that we just have to clearly identify with respect to character building through sports. And I think for us, it does give us the opportunity to clean our house, you know, while we are pressing pause. You know, when we get back into this, you know, most of us aren't looking to bring in trash into our home, right? The trash that was already there. Now that we have an opportunity to kind of have a clean slate, if you will, we have to challenge the leaders and certainly the parents to be thoughtful about some of the stuff that we were allowing to have happen before COVID. And now that COVID has happened, and hopefully when we're able to return, we're going to challenge you to be thoughtful about, you know, what wasn't acceptable before, but really now we're not going to allow it back in. As we now have a really clean house, we're not going to let you bring the trash back in.
Yeah, I like that. I like that, Trennis. Just, I think it's a really great time to reevaluate kind of some of our behaviors and maybe how much priority or emphasis we placed on sport. And I think, you know, there's something to the absence of it. So now that we don't have it, you know, perhaps this is a time for us to really step back and think critically about, you know, what are our goals? What, you know, what do we really want our kids to get out? And, you know, how can we better support them? And I almost wonder if we might see an increase in family relationship quality because parents won't be barking at kids, you know, and they obviously have more time to spend together. So I would agree that it's a really good time for self-assessment.
Do we worry that, I know as I think about this, one of the things that I worry about is that the incentive structures that are in place that have kind of driven the behaviors that are undesirable to begin with, you know, aren't necessarily going to be removed as we return. And so I guess my fear, or where I'm not as optimistic, is without a shift in those incentive structures with regard to scholarships and professional outlets and whatnot, is there a fear we just kind of accelerate back into the same, if not worse, situation? And we don't know, but that's something I think about a lot. And I don't know what the rest of you think about it.
I think there's a good opportunity to think about that, especially as we talk about youth athletes progressing to next levels up. Before we turn that in that direction, though, Elizabeth, I think you wanted to add something to the previous topic as well.
Well, yeah, someone mentioned the inclusion of parents, and I think that in this time and age of COVID, they've had to step up as teammates, as coaches. So we have seen more families involved in the activities. And for us, I think we're trying to get the youth to stay physically active, regardless if it's, you know, playing with a basketball or just having a Zoom session with mom, dad, or, you know, siblings. We just need that physical activity incorporated to their daily lives because they're on Zoom all day for school. So they need that break to just get their bodies active. And I think that we need to work very deliberately in making sure that they get that physical activity daily, but also working with the families to help us because they're the ones actually that are there with the kids. The coaches are not there, and we can instruct them as much as we want, but they are actually going to be the ones helping us deliver the lessons or the instructions to do the physical activity.
Elizabeth, oh, go ahead.
No, Matt, your point was valid, though, I think, in being honest with, you know, some of the noise that was in the system and what do we think, why do we think from our societal perspective that, you know, it's a society that struggles with getting rid of it, you know, period, you know, that somehow we're going to protect it from getting in. I do think that as we're able to get some time to reflect, empowering parents with some of these conversations around why character matters and why opportunities and around scholarships and some of the other things these kids aspire for, that like your character is associated with you getting that opportunity or earning that opportunity. And before, I feel like we would do it before a layup line, or somebody would have a speech and it would be one ear out the other, where's the ball, I want to play. Now it's like, look, there is no game. You know, so the way that we're doing this is preparing our minds and knowing that here's some research on, you know, opportunities that people have lost because they haven't put the right perspective or priority on who you are as a person, how you treat people, what your nonverbals are, you know, with your coaches and officials and your teammates and things like that. Because most of us aren't LeBron, most of us aren't KD, where it's obvious that, yeah, that guy's a pro. Most of us are in a gray area, and coaches have a choice in who they want to select. And, you know, most of them don't want, you know, to have to deal with a knucklehead in their program that they're going to have to follow around and make sure that that person's doing the right thing. So I think during this time of pause, we should instill these tools with our parents so they have an opportunity to have these conversations, and so it has a chance of getting a little deeper in the conversation.
Yeah.
I think that one.
Oh, go ahead, Elizabeth.
I think that we've also realized, I'm also a parent, but I've heard from many of our parents that they've realized the importance of physical activity in sports now more than ever. Even, you know, the Olympic athletes are creating workouts to encourage the youth to stay active. So I think that we've woken up and realized, oh my God, how important is physical activity in our lives, not only as children, but also as adults. So now as a parent, I want to keep my kid physically active. I can't take them elsewhere to get physical activity. So I, you know, took it upon myself to say, okay, I'm going to coach my kids to run their first 5K. So I think that it made me responsible for that, but I needed the tools, the guidance from, you know, the program leaders to say, okay, this is the step by step, but you know, they empowered me to do this.
Yeah, nothing will reinforce the need for physical activity more than being imprisoned with your children in a quarantined household as they just run circles around you. So I can empathize with that. And to Trennis's point about integrating the research too, you know, there's increasing research in these areas that is showcasing the benefits of physical activity in youth sports. And I wanted to plug Elizabeth's organization, the Women's Sports Foundation. They've put out a ton of cool resources. They do a lot of really important work in this area, and you should check it out if you haven't clicked around their website. There's a lot of cool stuff.
That's a good opportunity for us to maybe talk a little bit about that programming, especially because we just celebrated the anniversary of the passage of Title IX earlier this week. And I know, Elizabeth, that Women's Sports Foundation did some virtual programming to acknowledge that, and that has implications for all kinds of levels. But can you tell us a little bit about the implications of Title IX for the youth programs that you're working with, and how you discussed that in that event?
Well, we were talking about Title IX and girls of color. So we know that girls of color are still not at the same level as, you know, their Caucasian counterparts. So we still had work to do then, and we have even more work to do now. So one of the programs that I work with is the Sports for Life program that works with nonprofits across the nation to provide resources so we can keep more girls, brown and Black girls, in sports, because many of them lack the resources. As we know, everything costs money. And so we don't want them to have any barriers to participate. And so underserved communities don't have access to, you know, safe spaces, transportation, equipment. So all those things add up. And so the Women's Sports Foundation goes into these communities and empowers these organizations, not only with resources, but research, tools, trainings, anything that we can do in order for, you know, those organizations to either start or grow their program. Because what we want to do is empower these girls not only on the field, but more importantly off the field. So we want them to picture themselves as leaders outside of the field. So we want to be encouraging them to go to college, you know, to aspire to a CEO, Fortune 500 position. So, you know, all the tools that you gain on the field can be translatable on in a boardroom. So we want to do that, especially for girls of color, because we know that they don't have those opportunities easily accessible.
I think that's an excellent opportunity for us to think about questions of equity and access in youth sports. As you mentioned, it takes a great deal of resources, a surprising amount of money that needs to be invested at the highest levels of youth sports. Has that problem been exacerbated? And this is for the whole panel. Has that been exacerbated because of the pandemic? Are there particular ways that we're going to see the disparity between the haves and have-nots become more pronounced?
Yeah, I don't mean to jump in quick here, but I think absolutely. And I know we often think of, and I've reflected on this a lot during the pandemic, but we often think about the money aspect of it. But I think what for me is more apparent is time. So like I am privileged because of my job that I can have flexibility to work with my kid on sports, right? And not every parent has that ability to say, oh yeah, we'll go work out from 10 to 12, or we'll go work out from 1 to 3 or whatever. So I think there's certainly, I don't want to underscore the financial element, but I really think those parents who have jobs that allow them to have time, whereas there's a lot of parents who just simply don't have that right now.
Yeah, I'll throw another stat at you from that recent Aspen survey that they did. And what they found was that 58% of the African Americans parents who responded said that they did not believe, or said that they did believe that they would return to sport participation at the same level as their kids did before. You compare that to Hispanic parents were at 66% and white parents were at 70%. And you can see immediately right there in terms of just thinking about the intention to potentially return to sport at the same level for their kids. And we already are seeing a gap, right, between this. And no matter how you shake it out, this is what you see generally when we look at the data. So.
I think parents are faced with some really tough decisions, some tough conversations with family units, right? As they reassess budgets, the impact of perhaps job loss or just more expenses when they're coming with this coronavirus. So in general, parents always have to decide what's best for my kid, right? And they consider, do I go on a travel team to get them recruited? Is that what's best for them? And I think now that divide becomes even bigger. Do I put all of the pot of money for my kids' extracurriculars into one child who might get the scholarship? Or do I divide it amongst siblings? And those conversations, I think, are going to have to happen. And it's a big deal. It's something to really consider.
And I would also say that, I mean, that's absolutely true. And Karlee has a great point. I would say that there is, I think, a false premise that kids are going to get a scholarship because mom and dad decide they're going to spend 30 grand on their baseball select team. That's just not how, coaches recruit. And so, in a gap of this space, how can we try to educate parents on, hey, look, if you want to, socially create an opportunity around your kids' select team, have at it, but don't think that it is somehow an investment of all of this money where you're spending maybe just as much in getting a scholarship as what the scholarship even costs, right? So, challenging and kind of checking parents as they, some of them I think intentionally are doing those things. Others, like someone has concocted the conversation and convinced them that this is, if they care about their kid and their kid is good enough to do all these other things, and giving them the hard sell that, hey, we need all your money. And now, they don't have access, or they're not having those conversations with those people. And we should insert the truth into that space so they know that that's not a requirement for your kid to participate and be good and get attention doing the sport that they love.
Well, and can I just jump in there, Trennis? Like, one thing to think about too is the recruiting process is likely going to change. Right now, coaches can't even look at kids in most cases. So, I'm not too optimistic here, but we might even see some leveling of like, hey, if you have a camera and a YouTube account, anybody can go out and film themselves working out, and a coach can see that versus, oh, I got to pay X number of dollars to go to the showcase or the camp.
Yeah, to that point, Karlee, has that been something that has caught your attention in the work that you're doing about athlete recruitment?
Absolutely. I'm so interested in this right now. This shift, as Elizabeth mentioned, the teams are having to shift to virtual modes. College scouts are shifting to virtual modes, and it's a whole new ball game, frankly. And it has, like Jimmy said, kind of leveled a little bit of the playing field, where athletes, if they can, somehow become virtual and get, maybe their film makes it to a level it wouldn't have before. Coaches are sitting at home with a lot more time, frankly, to look at things like game film. It also, though, is interesting. My biggest, I guess, fear with recruiting is that we're not able anymore to ensure that the student athletes are going to find the right fit. I mean, I remember, that feeling like I found the right fit. I fit with this team, I fit with this coach, and I'm just not certain that virtual atmosphere is going to ever allow for that. And then you add the pressures that we're talking about with family finances, the pressure to get a scholarship. I'm worried that we're going to have a bunch of verbal commitments happening that don't actually align with the student athlete fit. So then we're going to see transfers down the line. And personally, in my little area of research, this is just fascinating. The fact that we're all virtual all the way now, it's through July 31st. So that pretty much eliminates all summer recruiting as we know it, the camps, the face-to-face meetings with parents. So yeah, it's very interesting.
And it will become a lot more regional, right? Like if you're recruiting a kid out of your backyard, there's a greater chance that kid wants to stay at home just because that's the known, as opposed to going across the country. So you're right.
Absolutely.
That seems like that's one of those opportunities where a certain kind of correction could be brought to the sports ecosystem. When we think about the kind of travel that has become normal, the kind of efforts to find a hidden gem of a recruit from all corners of the globe, in some cases, that has led to the acceleration of staffs and costs and pressures. I don't know how optimistic I am that those things will get contained, but as you all have commented already, there are some opportunities to maybe realign in some ways that are a little bit healthier. Matt, you made a comment earlier about free play, and I know that's an area of interest for you as a scholar. I wanted to give you an invitation to maybe talk a little bit more about what that might look like moving forward.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the things that does excite me about this opportunity, because it's forced us back into our streets, right? Back into our immediate surrounding neighborhoods. And we've become so detached from that over the past decade or two, for a number of individually kind of legitimate reasons that all sort of came together and created this perfect storm that basically stamped out pickup and sandlot and all of those things that even my generation grew up with, and obviously previous generations to that. And so a lot of the work that I've done in terms of my own research has looked at, well, what is the value of a sandlot experience? What is the value? What are we losing if those things go away? And I've found some interesting connections to the development of creativity, the development of kind of community and a sense of community, your development as an athlete, and your sport specific skills can be augmented in a developmental context where you have opportunity to play in different types of sports settings. And the really interesting thing in some of the work that I've done is that it's not an abandonment of organized sports and a full embrace of sandlot, unstructured sports. It's just like finding a little bit of opportunity to infuse that into an overall sports experience for kids has shown, or has connected with all these benefits. So my hope is that we see a return to that. My hope is that, and I don't think we'll ever see a full return to it, but that we start to recognize there's value in that. And as we play in our immediate spaces more, we may reconnect with those things that are so elemental and fundamental to participating in sports long term, which is fun, and developing that fun and connection and joy that is the foundation for sports participation. And a lot of that, I think, comes through more organically in an unstructured type of setting. So that's one area where I'm kind of cautiously optimistic. We might see a little uptick, and that could be a good thing.
Yeah, it's nice to feel a sense of optimism out of some of these moments, given everything else. And so I hate to pivot back in the other direction, but something that Jimmy just mentioned and Karlee was commenting on as well, the virtual landscape. Jimmy, I know some of your work recently has turned to abusive practices by coaches. And is that something that is there a higher risk for that in the virtual context that you might want us to attend to?
Yeah, I think so, just because now those traditional, I mean, on one hand, it could be a good that face-to-face interaction is not there as much as it could be in the past to open up opportunities for abuse. But at the same time, a lot of kids, I know even my kids, I've noticed just more time spent on their devices and stuff. So I do think we have to be careful about just, how much time they might be spending. And the virtual stuff is good. I mean, we're seeing some positive things, but we also have to understand that there could be some risks if, hey, coach wants to be with me on Snapchat all the time. We might need to think about that. And sometimes when kids and really anybody's left to their devices with too much idle time on their hands, bad things can happen. So, I definitely think that's something to be careful about, just because it's a passion area for me.
Right. Yeah, and Trennis, thinking about the Positive Coaching Alliance's mission, are there other stressors that come out of the current climate that might contribute to coaching behaviors? Are there programmatic choices that you all are going to make to try to help reinforce the positive aspects of coaching?
Yeah, I think it's essential that, again, we're restarting and resetting this conversation, and that's what we're challenging coaches to do. Do they have an understanding of what they want the kids to do, and do they have a requirement of their parents, and are they leading with those conversations that before, they said, well, we're too busy, we've got to practice, and so I can't create this document and have a conversation with my parents about what my expectations of them are. Well, you don't really have that excuse now. And so I think it's important, we're challenging coaches to do those types of things. And then in terms of how they treat the kids, I think that, this added energy that we have around wanting to get back into the game, I think makes people reflect on missing it, right? Like, that's that we all feel that, and it hurts us and it's disappointing. And so for us, it's tapping into that emotion, being like, look, this is something you actually loved, right? Like you enjoyed it, and you don't have it right now. And so let's make sure that when we do get back to it, you're treating it as something that you love, as opposed to something that's a task or something that, is going to make you rich or whatever else, right? Like if you love it, show it. And so that's one of the things that we're trying to instill, certainly within youth coaches. And even going back to Matt's point around even pre-play, right? Like at the lowest level or at the highest level, I know working for the Suns, it's funny, we would bring in players that would try out and try to make the team. And ironically, for some of those teams that, were very strict and stringent, and this is the way that we run, and, this is the way that we play, it was really hard for those players to make the team because they didn't really know how to play. Like everything was, you sit in this corner and you do this one thing. And if you don't, you're coming out, and now all of a sudden this kid's trying to, become a professional, and they can't because they've been told to sit in the right-hand corner the whole time. So, how can we make sure that, we're empowering these kids and allowing them to have fun and learn how to play with freedom. And I think all of us have fallen in love with the sports that we love because it has that freedom, not because it is stringent or strict or required that we do one thing, do everything, have fun.
I think that observation carries over to education broadly in a world where we have so much structure that's imposed very early time for kids, and then all the way certainly through college. And that sometimes makes it difficult for students to see those opportunities for creativity. We're getting, unfortunately, already to the point where we need to probably move to wrapping things up a little bit. So I want to make sure that everybody on the panel has a chance to kind of respond to to a final question, which is really a way of saying, what are you most paying attention to moving forward, whether it's a concern that you have about youth sports, whether it's the optimism that you may have, and Matt, you may already have alluded to some of that, but as we move forward, hopefully sooner rather than later, what will you be paying attention to, and what should we be paying attention to in youth sports? So we can start anywhere, but I want to make sure everybody has a chance to answer that.
And I can start, and I can just echo what I've heard from our community partners. And it's that, you know, as parents' incomes change and everything around them is going to change as well, there's going to be a greater demand for their services and not enough resources. So when they have a greater demand of kids, then they're going to need more staff. They're going to need a larger space. So they feel like, okay, we're going to get an overwhelming amount of kids come into the program, but not have enough resources to tend to that.
Yeah, to that point, I'll sort of build off of that. What I'm really interested in watching are these sort of market, like structural factors. You know, like, are we going to see shifts in the way we think about and incentivize youth sport participation? And what are then the flow-on effects that might have to the way that we design and implement programming? So sort of building off of Elizabeth's points, I'm watching it from a really like zoomed out perspective as to like what's shifting here that's going to have a domino effect that may be hopefully positive, you know, but not necessarily, you know, as we move forward.
All right, I can zoom in since you zoomed out. So I tend to think about messaging a lot. And so I'm sitting here thinking about being, you know, a young student athlete, and I'm concerned now about how many mixed messages are out there for everyone, let alone for someone who is a young student athlete, perhaps hoping to either have fun or to get a scholarship, right? Any end of that spectrum. And you have parents that are pressuring one way or another, protect yourself or, you know, go play. And you have coaches saying things, and I can't help but think about all the work on concussions and how we know that athletes at all levels struggle with that decision. So I worry. I do. I worry about these young athletes making those decisions in the moment. Do I play? I have a little cough. Is that bad? Do I keep going? Maybe the asymptomatic, you know, they don't know, but their lung capacity is diminished. So I just worry a little bit about those student athletes that are faced with those decisions.
Can I just?
Oh, you muted yourself there, Jimmy.
Okay, I'm sorry. Let me just give you a quick context. So, you know, the injury thing, we're involved in baseball right now, and just in the 3 weeks that we've been back playing tournaments, we've already had 2 kids have arm injuries and be hurt. So, you know, these kids, you know, and I have no idea what they were doing, not doing during the shutdown, but, you know, kids aren't practicing and getting the reps, and then all of a sudden they come out and they're trying to throw, you know, as hard as they can. I think we're going to see a big spike in arm injuries. So I definitely share that. The second thing I think for me is just this notion of how central sport is to many families' identities. And so what happens to the family identity when those opportunities aren't there? So, you know, gosh, we're actually at home for dinner. What does that look like? You know, we're not on the road every weekend. And then the last one for me is I think it's going to be really interesting to just look at the intersection with the political and the economic ramifications here of, like, because we know every state is kind of at a different place. So Texas, you know, is a lot different than California. And so how did...
Jimmy, you got yourself muted again there.
Sorry.
That's all right.
You know, balancing the public health with, you know, hey, we need the money that comes from having the teams come to these venues, and we're bringing in people from out of state. What are the public health implications for that? I think that's worth watching too.
Yeah, for me, I think it's the economics right there to kind of piggyback off of Jimmy's point, right? Like, at what point are we going to expose our kids to being sick or vulnerabilities that they should not be exposed to for the almighty dollar, right? Like, these hotels were built around these facilities that need to be filled, and they've been empty for months. And so, you know, at what point are we willing to, you know, expose our kids, and by way of our kids, our society, to something that maybe we need to make sure that we're playing the long game in this, and saying, okay, if we cut a corner here, we try to put a whole bunch of people in a room there, it's actually hurting our ability to get back on the field and play with reckless abandon that we want to. I think all of us would rather not worry about these things than to worry about them. And so, we know that it's incremental as far as how, things expand and how things open back up, but are we paying attention to, making a sacrifice right now? So, in 6 months, 8 months, all of us can reflect on this and write a book on it, but it's not something we're having to deal with at that moment. And that's my hope, is that people cooler heads and sober heads can prevail for the benefit, betterment or benefit of all of us.
Yeah, that's from all of you, a really, really thoughtful insight, and certainly provides us with a lot of framework to ask questions about youth sports and to think about where we're headed and what kind of messages we are sending. Over the course of the 6 town halls that we've had, we've been really lucky to have amazing guests. And that's definitely the case today. And I really want to thank all of you for making some time. And since this is the last of our scheduled series, I also want to just acknowledge the Moody College of Communication and the staff of the Center for Sports Communication and Media, our program manager, Chris Hart, and our communications specialist, Megan McGoey, who have really helped to make these things happen. So to all of our panelists, Matt Bowers, Elizabeth Flores-Amaya, Trennis Jones, Karlee Posteher, Jimmy Sanderson, we're so grateful for your time and your expertise. Thank you all for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you on the other side of this soon. Take care, everybody. Thanks.